look at a couple of boilerplate issues that are concerning us now in Nightmare America. We've called this series of podcasts CTS, or Acts with an @ sign, and CTS, Acts of Solidarity, Navigating Nightmare America. And the first issue that we're going to be addressing in podcast number 1 is the issue of immigration. And the second podcast will be host of 2 issues. And the first is, I think, Solidarity with Black and Brown Lives, or Black and Brown Lives Matter, Police Brutality, and the School to Prison Pipeline. So we will be around for questions afterwards if you have questions that are not answered in the context of the panel discussion, where I'm leading the questioning and the students are doing the answering. Thank you. The following podcast is one in a series of discussions by students on April 4, 2017 at Chicago Theological Seminary. The series is called Chicago Theological Seminary's Acts of Solidarity, Navigating Nightmare America. Chicago Theological Seminary is Chicago's longest-standing institution of higher learning, where we prepare women and men to be leaders for the next. I am Dr. JoAnne Marie Terrell, Associate Professor of Theology, Ethics, and the Arts, and I will serve as host and moderator of the various panels. Our subject is on the current administration's immigration policy in American civic life and its effects on various communities. Our panelists are Jonah Weisberg, Teresa Pasquale Matus, and Haman Hong Shin. Jonah and Teresa are first-generation naturalized citizens of the U.S., and Haman Hong Shin is from Seoul, South Korea. First, we want to get some sense of what the current administration's talking points on the issues of immigration are, and how that's being seen by various individuals and families from various communities.
Well, I can say that there's been a hyper-focus on creating a sense of danger or villainousness in certain populations of immigrants to create fear, to reinforce legislation that's being pushed forward, specifically Latin American countries, with a focus on Mexico that is correlated also around the creation of a border wall that's meant to keep out people that are being delegitimized as less than human, as criminals, as rapists, ideas of there being actual lists and registrations, much like World War II Nazi Germany, where you would list the criminalities of those people to dehumanize them, as well as people from Muslim countries being identified specifically with terrorism as a focal point to be able to keep out and limit immigration from certain sets of countries.
Can you, any of you, humanize the struggle of some of the folk who you've seen from both first and second and perhaps even third generation immigrants? What kinds of things are they facing, whether they're documented, having achieved residency or citizenship, or whether they're undocumented? What kinds of things do you see happening to folk? Who are the actual targets of the policies that we're seeing put in effect?
I would say that undocumented immigrants are the most targeted in this case. What do you think?
I would say undocumented immigrants. I would say it's having a heavy impact on family systems, where parents are being pulled out of family systems, where children are legal immigrants, and parents are undocumented immigrants, and both the fact that that is already happening, has been happening, is happening at increasing levels, that raids are being created in various cities, creating a sort of sense of panic, and then just this sort of imminent fear of that happening more frequently for people.
Can you give us an example of that in a particular community or among a particular family?
Well, I know within particularly Latin American communities, people are being more vigilant about carrying around multiple forms of ID, whether or not they're legal immigrants or they're in some other kind of transitional immigration status. People being extra cautious and having this sort of fear, this imminent fear, and there's been multiple situations and stories in the news where people, even with legal immigration statuses, being taken in for questioning, being isolated from family or even legal support, regardless of their status. I know, I have people that I know that are on various levels of documentation or undocumented. I'm an international adoptee. I have a friend who is also an international adoptee. My records were put in order by my adoptive family. They were not in the same way for her, so she has a different immigration status. Although she has a green card, she's having to seek legal representation to find out exactly what the parameters are of her green card as these things sort of shift, and trying to figure out, although she's lived here just like me her entire life, except for a few months when we were in our country of origin, what is this actually going to mean? Is she going to be deported back to a country she's never lived in? Is that a potentiality?
What survival strategies have individuals and families come up with to cope with the stress or threat of removal or even of vigilante violence? Because we've heard of some of that in the news as well.
I would say one way of survival strategy to cope with the stress is to find a meaning in a political situation that is taking place against some immigrants right now. Viktor Frankl suggests that we can find a meaning even in suffering and chaotic situations. One of the ways to find a meaning is to talk to someone about your own feelings and what does the feeling you have means to you. Another person that I have great admiration to is Judith Herman. Suggests that talking to someone you trust about how you feel can help to cope with stress, because it is a form of catharsis. Also, I think it's planning ahead for good and worse of what possibly can happen in the future. I think that is helpful for an immigrant to reduce his or her stress. Being aware about your legal rights in this country, remind yourself, even though the political situation against immigrants right now is not the best, there are many Americans are supportive and sympathetic to the situation with immigrants.
But you talk about survival strategies that people can come up with, but what if people don't have access to those kinds of resources? How can the communities that form the larger identity for that person, how can they help to protect people, to assist them with finding external resources to deal with the question of or a problem that might be posed by an over-aggressive immigration and customs enforcement?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think social media has done a really good job of beginning to circulate things that people might not have access to, even knowing what, who to talk to or what organization to go to. I've noticed really great kind of guerrilla campaigns of sending around just basic, these are the 5 things you should know if you're stopped. These are the 5 things you should know if somebody asks you these questions of immigration. These are the resources. This is when you can ask for an attorney. Those kind of basic things, as well as in the early days of the administration of 45, there were larger manuals that were being circulated around virtually through Facebook specifically that were accumulating resources and things, access points that people could have, that people could begin to utilize and even prepare in anticipation of what's happening now, that are being even expanded upon, that are becoming like Google Docs and virtual resources that are creating these sort of massive compendiums.
I totally agree with her opinion, but in addition, I think offline meeting and translation are really important strategy to survive this country, because there are many Korean elderly people in Chicago area, but they don't access to social medias, and someone could not read English and they cannot speak English, so that's why we need offline meeting and we need translations. We need many volunteers who translate English and who organize offline meetings in this area, I think.
What has it meant for you as an international student to hear of the shifts in immigration policy in American government?
Actually, there are international students who want to stay here. They want to get a job in this country, settle down here, and they want to raise their children, have family in this country. But not all of them, but many of Korean students want to stay here after their graduation. But the political atmosphere is rapidly changing comparing Obama administration, because the Donald Trump's reduce kind of the opportunity to stay here. We can feel that, and it's kind of to create the fears among international students.
So, how are the local churches or mosques, synagogues, and temples engaging in these issues? Are there ongoing collaborative efforts with other community organizations to actually help people to find those translation services, to help people locate legal services or free legal aid, to help the people who are really threatened by the rhetoric and by the intentionality of the current administration to expel them, and also the rhetoric that leads to so much violence in this context as well. Violence against people who don't even come from the presumed country of origin that the violators assume. So, can you speak to that a little bit? How can local churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples relate, or how are they actually responding to these issues, if you know the answer to that?
Now, I'm the member of UCC, and there are many UCC churches where open the door and welcome immigrants. They hired a lawyer, and they're doing kind of document ministry for that.
What theological basis would you use to combat the travel ban that is proposed against mainly Muslim countries and persons of faith? Scripture, tradition.
Jesus was not a Christian, as well as traveler. He was a refugee when he was a baby. Then, in today's context, the travel ban means when Jesus traveling and rejecting Jesus Christ in this country, in my understanding. What do you think?
That's totally true. When he was a baby, he was a refugee.
Yeah.
He was a refugee in the context of today in a Muslim country, which is Egypt. So, I'm sorry.
And he also was a subject of an occupied country. And he died as a subject of an occupied country. And so...
Which I also think is the difficulty with the the origins of the theological framework was built on the life of a person, a divine being, and also a human person who lived in this context, lived in this way, in the very way that people are being persecuted now under the premise of it being a Christian nation. This idea of empire, a colonized empire, creating the very flip, the very opposite of the predisposition of the faith that sort of birthed it, or that it says birthed it as a Christian nation, is now doing the very thing to oppress people that are the Christ in our time, that are the living incarnation of Jesus in our time.
Actually, there are many kind of travels. Someone go to travel for the vacation. They want to take a rest and use money for their comfort. But someone do travel because of the oppression.
Mm-hmm.
In my understanding, in Old Testament, there are people who escape from the slavery, oppression. Exodus is one of the examples. And the ban travel means ban Exodus and justify slavery and oppression. So the Donald Trump's the travel ban is really relevant to the biblical tradition and context. I think I remember the Egypt Pharaoh, he banned travel of Hebrew people in Egypt because he need slavery to sustain that oppressive economic system in the state. So I think it's pretty similar to Donald Trump's travel ban to this context.
I think we forget that this country is putatively founded on the desire for religious freedom by those who are themselves seeking asylum from England and places in Europe. And we forget that the country is designed to be a sanctuary country as we consider the plight of immigrants today. My last question has to do with this. As a religious leader being shaped here at Chicago Theological Seminary, how would you direct the church, the temple, the synagogue, the mosque, to think in relevant ways about the issues of immigrants and to respond to them in humane ways?
Can I introduce biblical passages here?
Mm-hmm.
I brought one passages in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 14.
Mm-hmm.
You shall not withhold the wages of poor and needy laborers, whether other Israelites or aliens who reside in your land in one of your towns. So, according to the biblical tradition, there are kind of the spirit for the aliens. So how do I respond this immigrant issue in my congregation or in my church tradition? So I want to say we have liberative, the biblical traditions in our spirituality, and I want to emphasize that in my church.
How would you direct your congregations to respond to this issue? Do you know?
I don't have congregation.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Or the people who fall under your sphere of influence.
Mhm.
How do you respond to it humanely?
Yeah, I think part of it is these conversations. So a beginning point for many people is just opening the door to understanding that there is a wider conversation, a dialogue, that there is reference in religious lineages and history for standing up for people, that justice is inherent to faith, and really galvanizing people, which actually I do see happening today in a variety of different constructs. I see people who before might have been, whether they're in congregations or they're just in communities, that might have been silent, that might not be having sanctuary meetings in cities across the country. So for me, a lot of my work is is speaking about things, is speaking into the context, is writing about it, and so and starting those initiating those conversations with people so that they begin in their own communities to do that. And I see that happening. I see people wanting to have these conversations and actually wanting to engage in practical ways, like how do you create spaces for translation, for document assistance in their church and faith spheres.
Thank you very much for your participation on today's panel. The subject is Black and Brown Lives Matter, Police Brutality. A follow-up subject is Solidarity with Black and Brown Children, the School-to-Prison Pipeline. Our panelists are Akira Carr, Melanie Jones, Jamel Garrett, Shay Watts, Geraldine Eulenberg, Teresa Smallwood, and Sana Syed. So at this time, I'd like to ask you to reflect on the linkages between white supremacy, police brutality, and the role of the media in especially automatically, reflexively criminalizing Black and brown bodies, such that these are the people who are the recipients of the force that is applied against citizens in this country. Start with Akira.
For me, the relation between white supremacy, especially the police system and its structure in the media, really starts back in slavery. A lot of it stems from what they had called slave catchers, which was the people that would come, the citizens that were required to serve, and they would come and basically catch any runaway slaves. If you had a slave that would run away, you would report it, and they would bring your slave back to you. If they brought their slave back to you alive and in fairly well conditions, then you will receive your monetary gain from that. But that's where it really stems from for me, because that's the foundation of the police system. You think about the whole idea of policing and catching a quote-unquote bad guy. That's where it really stems from for me, and I like to go back to the root, because I feel like if your foundation is a little rocky, then that will cause the whole system to be fragile, which is why I think the police system is, or the police department as a whole is in the way that it is now. In terms of the media, I think the media really played a big part of, you think about newspapers during those times, the first couple of newspapers that were ever made, there was a lot of comics in reference to the black ape or the black monkey, and it's this big figure who was here to attack you. So you then begin to paint an ideology and a picture in someone's head of what someone or another group of people rather is, based upon what you feel like they are, and that's just to instill like scare tactics. So I think about like even bringing it forward to cases like the Lenny Bias case, a big case that really pushed forward the war on drugs. That really helped shape the mark of what the criminal is, or who the criminal is rather. They actually use his face as that criminal face, and they try to make it look like he was the victim, but it also criminalized him in a major way. He had an issue with, I guess, drugs or whatever the case may be, and they took that and they ran with it. And then he became the face of the war on drugs. And this is why we need to fight this war on drugs. This is what it's doing. And now you not only take away the effect that the drugs are bringing, based upon you bringing it in as government, but you also give a picture of who the criminal is. And by doing that, you paint that in someone's head of what this person is, what this person is capable of, and you can just create different scare tactics. So it's just been done repeatedly in different ways over the course of time. You think about it now, you think of people like Mike Brown or Trayvon Martin and how they're very criminalized, and even though they're the victims, they're the ones who are being brutalized, they're the ones who are being killed, and they're still criminalized some way, somehow, through the media. And the media really plays into the criminalization of the black body, because it helps to continue to perpetuate that whole stereotype of you need to be scared of the black body. So that's how I feel like the whole media plays a big part in the structure of the police system as well as white supremacy, because it keeps the ideology that white people are above and black people are below.
I think for me, I've been trying to make connections between using photographic images between the kind of police brutality that was present during the civil rights movement, as well as what we might be experiencing now, and even particularly during the moment of Ferguson. And many of the images during that time reflect, although particularly when the Michael Brown moment and in Ferguson, there was the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, and there were protesters responding to both the kind of attack and death of Michael Brown. There were images or media that were reporting that there were looters and there were riots and there were all of these protesters who were violent. But the images actually reflect that the aggressors were the police, with these armed military garb, with the guns that were definitely kind of military weaponry and so forth. And these same images were reflective of similar images that we might refer to as Bloody Sunday during the civil rights movement in Selma, Alabama, when civil rights protesters who were marching over the Edmund Pettus Bridge were attacked by white police officers. And that moment was particularly memorable in America's history because it was the first time in which this kind of attack by police officials was captured on television. So to see those images be a reflection almost 30 to 50 years later in the Ferguson moment really helps me to see that there is a continuing narrative, and it becomes even more seen that there is a sense of militarization of the police that is attacking brown bodies and is scripting a narrative that even Black resistors are violent.
For me, the mass media historically, within the United States, particularly as it pertains to Black communities, has always been a double-edged sword. Because in one instance, it is a way to increase awareness in terms of Mama Till's decision to have an open casket showing of her son, and then other instances of Dr. King and other major civil rights figures utilizing the media or being used by the media to bring national exposure to the civil rights movement. But I say it's a double-edged sword because, and you both have spoken to it historically, stemming back from even the slave communities and even the Reconstruction era, where you have these proliferation of images of maimed bodies, broken bodies, hung bodies, and a desensitization and dehumanization that comes along with that, particularly within the context of things not really changing is the issue for me. So take that within the context of a Laquan McDonald, and people being enraged, people being dissatisfied, but not really understanding the political and civic process that goes into changing those things, or trying to prevent those type of instances from happening. So, like, examining police contracts is something that's critical, and we had this discussion, I think a month or two ago, and just not really understanding how to fight the war on all fronts when it comes to police brutality, yet having these kind of largely decontextualized imagery floating through the virtual realms in order to make people feel bad, I think is not enough in and of itself. And so it'll be interesting to see how activists moving forward utilize the media to destabilize mass media efforts to thwart the movement. I'm really intrigued in terms of that process, particularly since even the social media outlets that people use are still dominated by white conglomerates, Facebook, Twitter, any of those. But yet there are Black activists, black people using technology to create their own social media platforms. So maybe that might be a way of destabilizing mass media.
Can I just change the direction of the question a little bit? I just want to ask if you have noticed what kind of psychic toll this has taken on communities of which you might be a part or that you might interact with. Is there some kind of psychic toll, a mental toll on folk with the onslaught of so many instances of police executions, really, of black bodies and brown bodies, and leaving them lying on the streets, and with the proliferation of media and the availability of cameras, cell phone cameras, all of that, we're having to relive this trauma day in and day out. And what toll is that taking on communities of which you might be part? Religious communities, civic communities, neighborhoods, or is it not a thing?
Well, I don't want to be out of order.
It's
Lynched body, hanging. Media being used to take a picture of it, to send it as a postcard, and to then memorialize this idea. I have to look at the crowd that's watching. And the crowd that was watching were people who had their children on their necks, looking at a lynched body. Now, that's some trauma, I would think. But the more traumatic is the fact that the bodies would be left hanging, right? And when they're hanging, the concept of someone really being able to internalize the fear. And that seems to me to be what happens when we see these bodies, or we see the recast of Castille's murder, or we see the replay. Certainly it is a prolonged sense of trauma, what Joy DeGury calls the post-traumatic slave syndrome. This notion that people could go through protracted periods of absolute trauma and still manage to live, still manage to go to work every day. But for me, the idea of supremacy and brutality come together most specifically when we think in terms of who was in the crowd. They were your police officers, your magistrates, they were your judges, they were the people in the crowd watching and staging the lynches. And they were preachers. And they were the folk who were the upstanding people, the supreme folk, the elite, the ones who, from an ideological perspective, were the ones who carried the day with morality. And in fact, it was a traumatic thing.
And what about the trauma to the communities that lost a person to lynching, or and I don't know whether we are equating lynching with the police state, but I certainly think they're contiguous with each other. So, what about the communities, that lost certain of their members, sometimes to false accusation, sometimes to just a question of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Trayvon Martin.
I think what we're also seeing is this sense of terrorizing within the communities. So trauma being one aspect or repercussion, but I think we've often talked about these structures of oppression. And what I see functioning within those is a terrorism that terrorizes these black and brown communities. Because to see a Michael Brown lay out for 4 hours, or to see Rakita Boyd shot in a crowd of young people just out having a good time, or any other example of these more recent killings, you're terrorizing communities that have multiple repercussions that result from that same terrorism. So it's one thing to say people are marginalized, or they're oppressed, or they're treated this way or that way, but these people are living terror daily, going to school, coming home, Policing used to mean, or was supposed to mean, safe or call because we need help. But today it just means, oh, don't call because they're just going to come in and start shooting up the people without even asking any questions. Many incidents of women coming to the door and the police just unload on the people that enter, pregnant women, etc. So I think our communities are being terrorized in multiple ways. And I think the blending of picture and history and this reality of what it means to show the dominance or how white supremacy works, and that African Americans, black, brown people have certain positions, and if you move beyond that, there are repercussions that come with that.
It also creates a big level of distrust within the community. You don't know necessarily who to trust. I can't trust the police who are supposed to quote unquote protect me, even though they haven't done it since they've been founded.
Mm-hmm.
But and I also can't necessarily trust my community because I'm not sure who is who. Because that leads to the problem of when you're in your churches, you have the police who are members of your church. Now you're like, do I give you a hug during the welcoming, or is this safe? It raises different questions. It raises a big level of distrust that's already within the community, and it makes people reluctant to work as a community, I think, in many ways, because if I can't trust you, then I can't necessarily work with you. We like to think that you don't need trust to be able to work with someone, but that is a big key in being able to work with someone, especially effectively. So when we think about the communities and their psychological state, I think that a lot of that is, like you said, trauma, but a lot of that stems from the distrust, and it's going to continue to perpetuate itself if nothing changes in terms of like the structure of the police system. But in order to change the community, I think you have to change those who are quote unquote here to protect the community. But then you have to change the image of who's here to protect the community. So I think that would be an interesting thing, especially when you think about these different prisons that are being closed down for whatever reason. It creates a lot of questions in terms of who's here protecting and what protection actually looks like. A lot of people feel like, I know especially within New York, the Nation of Islam was very big, especially in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, 90s, because they offered this big sense of protection, and everyone wants to feel protected. So since they was able to offer that, it was like, and then when you see them, the image is totally different as well. I'll see them now, I'll be outside, and they'll be walking down the street, and they all have on suits. Not saying that if you're not wearing a suit, it's nothing wrong, but the image of that was just completely different, because the image that you're used to seeing of a black man is just someone that's either being shot or doing a shooting or something that is very quote unquote negative. But that image, it was an image of power. And so that you see the community start to transform, or you see how they start to dismantle that once they see the transformation starting to happen. So that's how it's a very big thing. I think that's why gangs were formed, because of the whole sense of protection. You can protect me. And then what do? I'm going to take the leader of your gang, and I'm going to now, it's like cutting the head of a snake. I'm going to take the leader of your gang, throw them in a jail cell for X amount of years, and then tell the gang to still kind of run on without any type of leadership, without any type of training from that old leader, no type of real communication with them. And you expect them to still be able to sustain. And then, you keep implanting different things, like you implant drugs, you implant the police system and everything else within the community, and then you infatuate that with it, and then you wonder why you have this big thing of deconstruction. So it's definitely trust and protection, I think, as well, that really causes a big psychological battle.
I also feel like there's a sense of internalized supremacy. So obviously ideas have consequences. So the idea of white supremacy, even though it might have started at one point in time, is obviously not over, and it has great consequences that are very far outreaching its initial kind of historical moment. And obviously there's internalized supremacy amongst white people in general, especially white police officers. And then there's also that leads, and the kind of police brutality that we see today leads to also an internalized oppression where people of color, and especially black people, kind of just the very facts of blackness, the ways in which people have to navigate just the facts of blackness are so loaded with consequences. So you don't necessarily have to even be doing anything. You could just be wearing a hoodie, you could be just walking, you could be running in the opposite direction of the police officer, and somehow you're still dangerous. You could just be sleeping and you're still dangerous. So, and then what does that do for people? What do they start believing about themselves? What do they have to contend with about their own lives? Even though, of course, people, of course, will still have a sense of who they are and will still have a sense of self, but there is internalized oppression in the sense where you come upon situations that you shouldn't accept, but somehow just because of the way things have been, you do accept those situations and you do accept that narrative about you, and you will not be able to contest it just because historically over long periods of time you've been forced to swallow that, and you've been forced to you have been made powerless in that kind of situation. So there's internalized supremacy, but then there's also this sense of internalized oppression, which leads to self-policing in ways that are just completely beyond imagination, where we have parents, black parents, who are telling their children what not to do and how to be and how to act in certain situations that are, that should seem ridiculous to all of us, but they're not, because if you don't act in those ways, or even if you do act in those ways, you're still very open game, fair game for killing.
Yeah, I think you're right on in the sense of self-regulation and policing as a byproduct of surveillance, which is one of the kind of primary functionalities of the police system, is to watch, right? And this sense of, in response to feeling as if communities are being watched, begin to police each other to keep from being under the watch of, or to not be seen as criminals. So it may require a shift in dress. Don't wear these kinds of clothes. It might require a shift in places that you go or things you participate in, and all of these ways in which we limit our functionality or sense of flourishing in the world as an attempt to stop policing. But even to recognize in this time that even as we make those self-regulations and policing, that they still will not save us. And that these kind of moves to respectability often do not protect us. That it does not matter if you have on a hoodie or a suit, you are still perhaps in harm's way when it comes to a brutal police system.
And particularly when we take it to the home, when the militarization moves us to battering rams, knocking down the doors of the grandmothers, and when they go in to the door with a battering ram, then they shoot the grandmother dead. And that becomes, at that point, what do you do?
Or the child sleeping on the couch.
Yeah. I came here from the District of Columbia, and of course, we all saw the Freddie Gray death and the reaction, the police reaction to the crowds. So we saw the shields, we saw the militarized methods by which they did crowd control, but we also saw the tanks. We saw the tankers. We saw in the aftermath of it all, it was revealed that they had rockets, they had rocket launchers, they had everything the military has. And in fact, we need to make the connection here that it's just not symbolic that there is a connection between Israel and our militarized police, but literally in at least 4 states that I am aware of, the police have gone to Israel to be trained. So it's real.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. To pick up off what you were saying, I'm from New York, and I'll get to that in a second. I want to comment on what you were saying about District of Columbia. We was in a group of friends and I went to Baltimore for to help with cleanup and stuff like that after the whole Freddie Gray situation. And the militarization of the police was extremely real. You couldn't walk down certain blocks. And the part that really got me, it reminded me of the foundation of the police system, the militarization of the police system, was the fact that you had a curfew. So they installed a curfew for everybody, and everybody had to be inside by a certain time. But if you was caught outside after a certain time, you were then brutalized and arrested. But if you so happen to have to go outside, you had to have walking papers, as if you were a slave being released from the master. You had to have literal walking papers. We did another podcast interview in Baltimore, and a lady who was running the interview, she had the actual paper. Like, her job had to give her a walking paper for her to be able to walk the streets of Baltimore, and that's where she was from. That's her home, and she had to have walking papers to be able to walk around. So that really tells you exactly where the mindset is, and where they were expecting to go. And it was only installed or used in certain parts of Baltimore. For a test run, me and my friend was like, let's go out and see if they're really going to arrest us. I don't know why we thought that was an okay idea, but we did it. And because we were in the downtown area and there were a whole bunch of white people around us, there was it wasn't a threat. But as soon as we get to the more urban areas, it was strictly enforced. There was no one allowed to be out. If they saw you out, even if you were on your stoop, they were coming to arrest you. If you did not have that quote-unquote proper walking paper, if you'd be able to walk the streets that you pay taxes in. And it was supposedly for this whole idea of creating safety. But you're creating more trauma, more trust issues, more of everything within doing that within itself. So the walking papers really blew my mind. I said, you have walking papers to walk around with? She was like, yeah, I need these. I said, that's a problem. That we are in, this is what, I think it was 2015 or 2015, and you still need walking papers. You as an African American, and you're just like, oh yeah, I have it. So there's this concept of, oh, okay, I'm fine, which is not fine. You're not fine because you have to walk around with these papers. So that was really interesting to me. We took videos and everything of like the militarization, all the tanks that were out and everything like that. But the walking papers really blew my mind because I was like, wow. And then to bring it back to New York, this whole concept of stop and frisk, that was a real big thing, and that they're actually trying to bring back, even though it was ruled unconstitutional. But that whole thing of being able to look at someone and say, you're a criminal because I looked at you and you look like one. Well, what does a criminal look like? And then you get back to the whole media and how they play their whole part within it. But the crazy part for me growing up was we'll be walking down the street and some of my friends, especially my male friends, would just get stopped out of nowhere for no reason. We're not loitering, we're not loud, we're not doing anything. We're just walking down the street of Harlem and we're getting stopped in a place that our parents pay rent for us to stay so that you can pat us down. And it was just one time, I remember we were in front of the McDonald's and one of my friends was stopped and he was just like, I didn't do anything, why are you stopping me? So when the cop asked him for his ID, I told him, no, don't give him your ID. And you don't have to give him your ID. He needs to give you his ID as well. We're going to do this exchange. Let's make it an even exchange. What is your name? And I'll tell you my name. Let's actually introduce each other. We're not going to just keep doing this terrorizing thing. And the cop was really mad. He pinned him up and everything. You're not going to give me your ID. What is your name? What is all that for? You have no reason to stop him. But because stop and frisk was still within the quote-unquote rights of the police, he was able to do that. He was able to come and just randomly say, I'm going to stop you because you look like you might be a criminal, which is really a problem within itself. But it's something that they're trying to bring back, and it'll definitely, I think, shift the community.
Can I follow up on that?
Yes, and then we'll have one more question on this and move to the next podcast.
At least on that particular issue, the stop and frisk, your mayor was decisively right on the fact that it has already been ruled unconstitutional. We're not going to review that. But to think that the President of the United States, the person who is in charge of the free world, so to speak, would even think of that, suggests to me that this conversation goes a whole lot deeper. But the statistics, the ACLU did a statistical look at what was the impact of stop and frisk. And in New York, from 2003 to 2014, there was less than 0.0% of those people stopped and frisked who actually revealed any kind of concealed weapon that was of any import. So the rest of the 99.08% of people has simply been harassed by the police. And they were largely black and brown people.
So Representative Richard Hudson, a Republican from North Carolina, has proposed a new gun law, H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act of 2017, and it has 58 original co-sponsors. And this bill would allow persons to carry concealed weapons across state lines as long as they have a permit for it within another state. What do you see as possible societal outcomes if this law is passed?
Yeah, well, I think this is should be troubling for all of us to think about this fallacy that's kind of reappearing, that the whole good guy or good person with a gun, you know, and who exactly are they talking about that's going to be carrying these weapons? Who owns these concealed weapons permits? Who, growing up in the South, I have a pretty good understanding of who that is, right? It's you know, maybe some middle-aged to older white men, maybe some white women, but I think this is troubling, and I think that it's only going to perpetuate and exacerbate the problems in our society that criminalizes black bodies versus white bodies, right? I'm reminded of on Facebook this idea of the open carry state. I don't know if you've seen the video as well. You know, you have a white person or so-called white person walking around with an AR-15, and what's up, officer so-and-so, and the officer is cordial, nice, whatever. But they tried a little experiment, right? And keep in mind this is an open carry state. It's completely legal to do this. A young black man is walking with an AR-15, and the officer, a car flies up, slams on the brakes, opens the door, yells at the young man, tells him to get on the ground. You know, he's the officer, this is my right, you know, get on the ground. And it's just very clear that a very stark distinction between how people are treated. And so
so you see this as disarming one community and arming another,
absolutely,
and making the disarmed community much more vulnerable.
Exactly. So now anybody walking in Walmart can shoot you if they think that they need to. And the whole stand your ground laws, I mean, this is only going to further exacerbate the systemic problems that you know, that we're seeing, not just with the police, but with people breaking into homes and people of color being killed for no real reason. But yet, even with video evidence, we can't seem to convict people that are obviously in the wrong, and executing people in the name of vigilante justice. So it's terrifying.
And I can never believe the jury that believed the claim that it was George Zimmerman who was crying on the videotape for his life.
He was the one at risk,
He was the one who was crying. They believed his mother rather than Trayvon Martin's mother, that it was Trayvon who was crying.
Although he
like
was
she
the
wouldn't
one
know
with
his
the gun,
voice.
of course.
Yeah.
And she wouldn't know her own son's
And
voice.
she wouldn't know her son's voice.
And doesn't the media perpetuate this too, though?
Yeah.
You think about...
Why is that even a debate to
Right.
me? You have the gun, and you're crying.
Yeah.
And
The 16-year-old kid is the monster.
Yeah.
Correct. Mhm.
Yelling help.
The 16-year-old kid who wasn't bothering anyone.
Just walking on the wrong street.
Okay, so a lot of the murders that have occurred due to police action have been of fundamentally children, 16, 17, even 18 as a kid, even 24 as a kid compared to me. But is there a connection between this policing of black and brown bodies and the school to prison pipeline? Is there like a logical sequence of what happens to black and brown children once they have experienced police surveillance and police hostilities, and what happens in school? Is there a connection between those things?
Absolutely. I, being from Chicago, very familiar with the reality that many of our schools, middle schools, high schools, have police guards, security guards. Some schools even children have to wear clear book bags in order to come into the school, with a kind of presumption that they have some weapons, or go through some schools metal detectors before they even come into the school. even once they've come into the school, the criminalization is not, in many ways, starts at school, right? So all kinds of senses of their behavior or actions are already criminalized in a way that gets them sent to have punitive kind of charges, whether it is detentions, suspensions that ultimately keep them from being fully active and participating in educational opportunities, but also that end up in records and link them to juvenile detentions that ultimately, as we know, this being a full pipeline towards a longer criminal history. And the schools, I mean, particularly with the police presence in the schools, a sense that the students are always the ones that put each other at risk, as well as a protection over what the administrators and the teachers, because the children are the problem, mostly black and brown children. So I absolutely think there's a connection. Particularly, I think that on the relationship of girls, there has been less kind of concern about the ways in which girls are the fastest population in the juvenile system, but how sex trafficking has also been linked to this pipeline to prison that has not been as talked about or discussed in these conversations as well.
And I have to add that we have to look at both the ways in which criminalization comes about, which is what you've so eloquently laid out, but we also have to look at the motivation. So the motivation, I believe, is the trend towards privatization and corporatization of black and brown bodies within the prison system. So this idea that we could have a pipeline is theorized around when can we identify those markers that will lead someone to prison? And then when they get to prison, how can we profit from those bodies? So this notion that if we privatize prisons, which has been done wholesalely in this country and around the world actually, then we invest in a new profiteering, a new capitalism, a new vein by which we can feed our greed. And so what we really see is Sodexo or some of the other corporations that really, their real book of business is prisons, but they hang around universities and institutions of education because that's where they feed their corporate greed.
So the fact that it costs the government $28,000 a year to host a prisoner rather than to employ a person gainfully is really beside the point, because it's still more profitable to imprison them than it is costly.
Stemming back to your point of the motive and how they actually target the kids. I know especially within New York, they judge how many prison cells they're going to build based upon the level of third grade test scores.
Absolutely.
So then how do I now systematically make sure that these test scores are low to make sure that the prison systems that I'm building is going to be able to be occupied within the next couple of years. So I make sure that the school system doesn't have the right funding, that they don't have the right books, that they don't have the right information, that they don't have the right resources, teachers, and all the things that they would need to actually succeed. I take that away from them and I strip it and I give it to another school based upon their district or their zone, which is where you're required to go, based upon where you live and your zip code. And I now restructure that money to make sure that these kids get here based upon their zip code, and then these kids automatically get here. That way I'm still feeding, like you said, my prison system, and I'm still able to feed and make sure that my prison system is there, and I'm still technically giving them the education, even though there's a big and vast difference in the different levels of education that is being offered. I know for myself, I went to Catholic school most of my life. I didn't go to public school until like the last 3 years of school, and that was traumatic. It was a very, very big difference. Catholic school, you have all these levels of privileges. I can have my phone in school, and you can tell me, give me your phone, and I can tell you no. And that's okay for me to tell you no, because I don't have to give you my phone. My phone was not out. I was not breaking any rules, and it's a sense of like rights. But within public school, it's not that. Public school, You can't have your phone unless you have this outstanding excuse and you have to get a note from the doctor, you have to get a note from this. I went through levels of notes to have my phone, for me not to even have it, for them to hold it in the office until after school is over. And then it's different levels of markets value within that, because then you have the corner store who's going to charge you $5 to hold your phone, but you need your phone. It's a safety issue now that is coming into play. And you go through the metal detectors, and then if you really need your phone and you know that if, let's say, little Billy is getting bullied after school, and I need my phone, I need to be able to contact my mother or whoever to come pick me up, and you're telling me that I can't have it because my excuse is not quote-unquote severe enough for you, what am I going to do? I'm going to still bring my phone. I'm just going to learn different ways to sneak my phone in. So that leads to different issues within itself. I know for me, myself, I was going to bring my phone. So, how do I get my phone in? Am I going to put it in my sleeve? What am I going to do to make sure that I get the access that I need? But it puts you in a position where you're quote-unquote forced to create different methods and different ways of getting your needs done, when you shouldn't have to do that. And it's something as simple as a phone, and it may not be that big of a deal, but you can go to the school office and make a phone call, whatever the case may be, but within today's context, it's a very big deal in terms of what's being taken away and what's being given. And like you were saying, the whole metal detectors, for me, that's another form of policing. Now I have to go through this metal detector every single day to come to school to learn. I have to be pat down to make sure I don't have anything. And it's like, where does the balance now come? Where is that line now drawn? You already said that I'm going to be a quote-unquote at-risk youth, which is another term that's just used to label a particular group of kids, particularly people of color and black youth, just to try and label them and say, this is the at-risk child, this is a quote-unquote good child. Now, how do we operate and use this at-risk child versus how do we operate and use this quote-unquote good child? And this whole thing of labels really plays into the mental capacity and concept. Because if you put in my mind that I'm an at-risk youth at a young age, and you put in my mind that these are the actions that are making me be an at-risk youth, and you're not giving me anything else to counter that, you're just helping me to perpetuate that, because now I'm like, this is what I am. If someone keeps telling you something over and over and over again, especially within the young child, and the shaping, molding moments of their life, that really shapes and molds how their outcome is going to be. So it's just different levels of systems, and it's like, how do you operate within each system?
Well, how do we ensure the safety of children in such a hyper-violent context that we live in? How do we ensure their safety without taking extraordinary measures to prevent guns in the school? Guns are readily available to children. How do we take back our educational systems so that they actually educate our children? How do we increase the quality of the education itself so that the children value that more than experience vulnerability?
In my opinion, I think part of the slippery slope of protection is that it is always trying to bring together or stop from or prevent in ways that end up being destructive. Whereas on the other side of it, if we are in the business of creation, of constantly trying to create spaces that call for educating our children, call for making not safe space, because we can't always guarantee safe space, but sacred space where we gather in covenants and communities with one another, call for rich dialogue and intense conversation. If we're in the business of creation, then hopefully we'll at least, if not make these spaces center, but at least have alternative places for people to be. And those spaces, if they continue to be created, then hopefully it will counter some of that which is trying to keep us from, exclude, bind, all of these other things.
Betsy DeVos, the current administration's education secretary, advocates school choice and charter schools which lack public oversight and have historically underperformed in terms of their educational output If the for-profit charter school becomes the industry norm, how will the school-to-prison pipeline be affected?
You won't be able to educate your kids. Most charter schools are ran by lottery. I know within New York it is at least. You have to put your kid's name, and usually parents put their kid's name in once they're like 1 or 2 years old, so that way by the time they're the age of 4 or 5, they can get some level of, okay, my kid's gonna go to this school or this school.
So
So,
this is closing an avenue of education.
yeah.
And increasing the likelihood that they'll turn to alternative.
You would have no choice. Because if I can't get my kid's name picked out of a hat of a lottery, then I have no choice but to, if it's public school's not an option, how would I then educate my child? If charter school is the only option.
Yeah.
You asked how can we? It's like almost like like I don't know. Maybe I'm just incredibly jaded with the current situation, but like the fact that that someone like that is now in charge of education, and I've watched my parents in South Carolina, like just my mom's now teaching in private school. They were teaching at a charter school that closed down, and like these kids are just being torn and bussed, and from a largely African American population, and it's just frustrating to watch that unravel and to know in South Carolina the education like budget, the resourcing has gone down every year, and Nikki Haley has just like it's gone, and to watch my parents kind of have to deal with that as well, and they're frustrated, and now South Carolina's 50th in education. I don't know, it's hard for me to think of a way forward at this point with knowing all that. You know what I'm saying? Like, hopefully this isn't podcast stuff. Just in general, you asked that question, it kind of made me like.
And I bet if you looked at the numbers, the money that went out of education went into prisons.
I think she also gave her cabinet members some bonuses.
And I believe that it's decisions like that that's only going to, for a significant number of Black and brown young people within our communities, communicate the notion or reinforce the notion that school as it currently stands is of no value to them. And so you'll see more people with legitimate critiques of the school system turning to the streets, whether that's selling drugs, whether that's the trafficking of their body, and those type of options to survive.
And I guess I'm wondering, what kind of activism is it going to take? What kind of voice and consciousness is it going to take from various societies? What is it going to take from the church, if they feel they have a role at all, beyond ecclesiology? I mean, worship is one thing, but activism is certainly another. We can't just sit by and watch people like this take positions, create these type of policies, or eliminate what's available, and then say, what are we going to do? And then everyone's on the street and no one's receiving the education except for those superior white privileged individuals, And it all seems like it's such a historical constructed. This is a little late in the comment follow-up, but when you said the person has to carry the piece of paper to move about the city, that made me think of Leon Higginbotham's in Matter of Color, and how he reviews the 6 early colonies here in the U.S. One of the major dehumanizations was no permission to leave the plantation. If you left, you must carry the piece of paper in order to be able to move about, and if not, then the repercussions, of course, all the way up unto death. And so I think we are really in a position. I had a few statistics, and I just briefly wanted to share just a few. We think about the U.S., 25% of the world's population. Well, we have incarcerated 25%, but we only have 5% of the world's population. When we think about how our young children are being suspended, we have 3 times the amount of African American children that are suspended in compared to any other. There's no state in the U.S. that does not have this large number of African Americans that are being suspended. So 40% of African Americans are expelled, 70% are in school arrest, and then 3.5 times the number of whites that are also arrested, and 68% are through modes to the state or federal prison. I read an article today in thinking about coming into this group and there was a fact sheet and a grid that we mentioned when and how do they prepare for young children. They are now starting as early as pre-K to determine who will be incarcerated, who will not make it. Pre-K. I mean, so when you think about these young children, and then they gave the statistics for the pre-K school, black children were at 47% versus the overall enrollment 19. Black boys at 45%, the overall enrollment 19. And black girls, Melanie, 54%, fastest growing. So the way that the disparities rise up, it's going to take some serious voice, some serious activism from many aspects within society in order to make a change from where we are.
How can we be more proactive with our children and youth especially to make sure that they have adequate education and meaningful work? How can we be more proactive in helping that happen without allies? And you know, what needs to happen in the community, in the communities where this is the reality? Do we just release our children to the system?
And really the question is, to what system? What system are we releasing? So for me, I don't want to end on a bad note. I want to believe in the hope that I carry on the inside. And I want to believe in the fact that in this moment, as abysmal as it sounds, that I live in a place of optimism. And my optimism is around this notion that if the federal government wants to shift itself, then it's time for me as an individual to shift myself. You know, I need to go into activism mode individually. So every child is my child. Every child is an opportunity for me to infuse, to sow seeds, to water those seeds that have already been sown. And every space, Melanie, that I'm in is a space of transformation. So if I'm in the church, then I've got to act. If I'm outside the church, I got to find some way to find that community of people who agree with me. And it's going to take relationality. It's going to take me understanding your story and not being turned off by the fact that you have a criminal record or you had some issues on your background. It's going to take me being careful enough to realize that there sits another human being. And but for the grace of God, we both could be gone. But because we've been given the opportunity to still live and breathe and have our being, it's time for me to care about you, brother. It's time for me to join hands with you, brother. It's time for us to get to work.
On a positive note, I too believe in the church, and I still think the church today has a role. I think they have a bigger role than they've ever needed to have before. I mean, church historically has always come from that challenge of discriminatory behavior within society. Even my own church is born out of racism in order to be able to have an opportunity to have the freedom to worship. To me, the churches can do things. You ask for examples. We can adopt schools. We can start to interact with the schools and see where that particular school's challenges are, what children need one-on-one care. We are going to have to do more than just worship. We're going to have to do more than just go to church on Sunday. We're going to have to get involved. And we can't let certain lines or perimeters limit our ability to make a difference within society.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's really about redefining, like you're saying, that whole sense of community and what community is and who community is. And I think the church has a very big responsibility, and I think we need to own that responsibility in terms of identifying what the issues of the community are and then working to solve them. So if you have a community issue where someone is hungry, then you obviously work towards make sure that they're fed. If you have an issue where someone is messing up in school, then you will work towards making sure that they are able to do better, whether that is through offering tutoring at your church, whether that is through offering different book reading programs, having different summer programs and stuff like that, to make sure that your kids within your church, that's your community, is always being fed in one way or another. It's like you already know that you can't depend on the government system to do the work. But as the church, it's kind of our requirement to do the work. If we're going to call ourselves, the church and Christians and followers of Jesus, it's the requirement to identify the issues of the community and then do the work to help solve those issues, whatever they may be. Whether that's mass incarceration, like you said, the whole concept of being able to see a human being for being a human being and not judging them. So if I'm able to do that and look at you and see that you're a human, then I can see your needs, because your needs are then my needs. Because whatever you may need, I may need, or someone else that I may know may need. And it's just about creating that sense of community. But you have to first build that trust again, because there's also a lot of distrust within the church, if you think about it. When you think about the different things that people either felt like the church should have been on and wasn't on, or the church was on and shouldn't have been on, it's a lot of distrust within the church. We have to work to fix that, so we can begin to build that sense of community, to be able to identify what the issues are. But if you don't know the community, you can't identify any issues. You can assume, like, okay, I know this is what it says, this is what it could be, but you have to really build that relationship to be able to know the community and be able to say, this is what you need, and this is what I need. So this is how I know this is what you need, because we all need this. And it's that whole sense of the village raising the child, in a sense. So the church becomes that village and that foundation that seeks to raise that child. Whatever that child needs is, if the system is not doing it in terms of like the government system, we know that the church is going to have our back and is going to do that. And that's how the church becomes the foundation again. There was a point in time when the church was really the foundation of most African American homes. At this point in time, that is not the case. There's a big option of whether you go to church or not. And I remember when I got that option to choose of whether I went to church or not, and I was so excited for that option, because it gave me the option to opt out of a community that I felt like wasn't necessarily the community that I wanted to be a part of. Right? So for me, I had to find that right church community where they were doing things. They had a program, Breakfast Before Books, because there was a disparity within kids only being able to eat during breakfast time while they were in school in New York. They had programs like tutoring, which really harped on the educational system. They had programs like food pantry, which really sought to feed the community. But they also had this sense of community as well within itself. So I'm not just going to give you the food and tell you go home and cook your food and have fun. No, let's come together, that whole concept of fellowship, and let's eat together. How do we now transform the community through love? How do we now transform the community through service? How do I now serve you and realize by serving you I'm also serving myself? And how does that now look dependent upon where when I was younger, I would speak to the people that you would be like, why are you speaking to them? So the quote-unquote crackhead, the quote-unquote alcoholic, the quote-unquote homeless person, they were my people. Because they were for me, they were just people. I just didn't necessarily notice their quote-unquote imperfections. Because for me, it was just us having a conversation. But that also transformed as I got older. It was just like, okay, how do I now speak to this person? This is a person. You speak to them like you speak to any other person. So it's keeping that concept in mind, I think. And you're going to be surprised. Everybody's story is not the same, and everybody has their own unique stories. So how do you now find that out and then be able to incorporate that within your own story, your own measure of growth? So.
Yeah, and then, sorry.
Go ahead.
Just tapping into the spirit of what has already been said. I definitely think it's important to all of our work here, our theological work and academic work, centers on some interpretation of history. And there are models and figures within our own rich history that we can look at that speak into the present complexity of issues that we're dealing with. So I think that's important. I also think the networking piece is critical on a grassroots level, but also institutionally. Whether that's the co-collaboration of black student groups, whether that's just knowing, hey, I'm over here, you're over here in case you need anything, or they're jumping on you over there. You have somebody like when Malcolm X sent the letter to Coretta Scott King. Things like that. And then also something that's very important for me that I've been thinking about is the way in which we understand ourselves within this capitalistic structure. And the ways in which we choose to participate, and then holding people to the fire that are exploiting the issues and getting capitalistic gains off the issues and posing themselves as our leaders, but not really possessing a bottom-up type of organizational structure where the people who make up your support and make up your check really have tangible benefits. So, and then and when it comes to the church, it's definitely a double-edged sword for me, because of the particular theological milieu in which I was raised. The church was a part of the problem within that context, but the church has also historically been a site of liberation, and a site of civic struggle, and a site of everything else that black communities need. So it's not going anywhere, nor does it need to go anywhere. But I do believe that the churches will be the first line of defense. The churches and our civic organization will be the first line of defense in trying to, and our neighborhood schools, et cetera, will be the first line of defense in trying to save our kids, and trying to educate them right, trying to give them the mind frame to handle all of the crap that they're going to have to deal with in the world. I think a lot has been said, and I just wanted to throw those things in there. But it takes these type of sit downs, and being real and being authentic with each other, and not being ashamed of that.
And I think that would be true not only of the church, but also of the mosque and the temple and the synagogue, that they need to be part of that first line of defense, to provide, in order to be more proactive in serving and protecting our youth, and also providing for their pressing need for food, clothing, shelter, and for education and meaningful work.